Welcome to today's webinar on the Supervision for Youth Peer Support Specialist. My name is Jasmine Boatwright, Youth Programs Coordinator with Youth Move National. This webinar is hosted by Youth Move National and the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operated and coordinated through the University of Maryland. Remember to introduce yourself in the chat box if you haven't already, and please stay on once the webinar has concluded to complete the survey, letting us know how we're doing. At this point, I would like to pass it over to our presenters from Portland State University.
Hi, everybody. This is Caitlin Baird speaking. I am a trainer and a program manager with Pathways to Positive Futures at Portland State University. We work on a lot of research projects that focus on youth and young adult peer support, and also how to serve youth and young adults who are of transition age with serious mental health conditions in multiple systems, focusing primarily on youth-driven practice. Previously to my job at Portland State University, I worked as a youth peer support specialist for young adults who were in the wraparound process, as well as a youth peer supervisor for folks who are serving youth and young adults in wraparound and for folks who are serving youth and young adults in drop-in center settings. So as a peer support specialist, as I'm sure that many of you know, that means that I'm drawing on my own lived experience as somebody who has been a part of the mental health system, as well as the juvenile justice system, in order to really serve youth and young adults and help inform my work. I feel really blessed to be able to do this, and I feel even more blessed to work with people who share the same sense of purpose and who share the same values in youth-driven practice, such as my co-trainer here today, Maria Arvidsson. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Maria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Arvidsson-Kritz. I'm a research assistant at Research and Training Center for Pathways to Positive Futures at Portland State University, and I work alongside Caitlin doing research and training, working to bring youth voice to the table at systems of care. Previously to working at Portland State, I did peer support for transition age youth and also supervised peer support specialists in a drop-in center setting outside of Portland. And like Caitlin, I also bring my own lived experience to the work in the mental health setting. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all today.
Thanks, Maria. So we'll go ahead and cover our learning objectives for today. Today, participants are going to learn more about the youth peer support specialist role, what is and is not a youth peer support specialist. We find that sometimes there's a little bit of role confusion, which is totally normal. We're going to talk about supportive supervision tactics. We'll also talk about how to promote a culture of self-care and also recognizing burnout and vicarious trauma. If anybody has any other objectives for today's presentation, please include them in the chat box. We're going to have some time for questions afterwards, and we want to make sure that you're getting the most out of this. Also, before we jump in, I would like to recognize that most of us are likely working from home, so you might hear some working from home sounds. For instance, I know that my coworkers for today are my cat Jude and my dog Polo. My cat is especially vocal, so if you hear some meowing or something of that nature, don't be alarmed. She just has questions about peer support too. So we'll start off with the basics. What is the youth peer support role? I want to acknowledge that it looks like a lot of you, according to your positions in the chat, probably have a lot of experience with this. So I don't want to assume that you don't know what the role is, but I think that in this experience, we also learned that a lot of the time there can be role confusion. This happens with professionals, this happens with parents, this happens with young adults, and I know for myself, it's even happened when I'm working in the role. So we're going to review some key points about what youth peer supports are charged with doing, how they might do that, And we're going to go over some key things on what they should not be expected to regularly do. Through this, we're going to also talk about some anecdotal experiences, and Maria and I will share how we supported staff through some of these misconceptions about youth peer support. So we'd like to start by introducing a tool. This is a tool that you can find on the Pathways to Positive Futures website, which I will make sure goes into the chat box prior to the end of our presentation. And it's called What is a Peer Support and What is Not Peer Support? And again, I really want to highlight this is focused specifically on youth peer support, not adult nor family peer support. The reason that we created this tool is we found that a lot of youth peer support specialists in the field were having to consistently reframe and rephrase what their role specifically was to, again, parents, youth, their coworkers, and even sometimes check in with themselves. So this is a free tool that if you are working with youth peer support staff, I highly recommend that you access via our website. So the way that we define youth peer support in this tool is somebody who works with people who are transitioning to adulthood, who are usually involved in child-serving systems such as foster care, mental health, juvenile justice, developmental disabilities, things of that nature, or they might be experiencing some sort of a unique challenge or trauma. Youth peer support specialists are usually close in age with young people that they work with. We call these near peers, and we usually recommend that folks be anywhere between the age of 18 and 30. However, sometimes you will run into, somebody in their 30s who might have that youthy vibe. That's okay. As long as it seems like somebody that the youth would want to kick it with, right? Otherwise, it's kind of defeating the purpose. And these folks use their own experience with mental health and child-serving systems to relate and engage with the young people that they serve. Their primary role in their work together is to help youth identify goals and to help youth really have a sense of what it is that they want to achieve in the various treatments or the various services that they are a part of. So we'll start with a few pieces on what youth peer support specialists should be doing. Now, the primary one is building hope, which I don't need to go into detail. That's super easy, right? Cue laugh track, just kidding. I know that you all are on mute. Building hope is something that can feel really large and nebulous for youth peer support specialists. The primary way that this is done is not only through building rapport and really listening to and treating the youth with a sort of mutual respect, but also strategically sharing your story. This is about using pieces of your own lived experience to help young people see sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. I know for me as a young person, and even sometimes when I'm still going through mental health challenges as an adult, it can feel like you're sort of at the bottom of the well with no hope in sight. And to have somebody there who has really been a part of that experience in order to help not only guide you, but help you see maybe some solutions in terms of being able to meet your own needs can be super, super helpful. It's also just nice to know that somebody understands what it is that you are experiencing. In addition to this hope-building piece and strategic sharing, what youth peer support specialists are doing is really holding space for a young person to talk about what they need to talk about without instruction. So making sure that young people have an area where they can really discuss some things that they're concerned about in their lives without the, I would say, interruption of maybe some of the other gatekeepers or caring adults that they have. The youth peer support specialist is really there for the young person and to help them decide what they think would be best for them. Related to this piece of building hope, as I mentioned, is strategic sharing. And one of the really important pieces about strategic sharing is making sure that you know what pieces of your story you want to share. So as a supervisor, I would often work with my youth peer support specialists on what are the things that they feel like that they are, A, comfortable sharing, and what are some of the things that they need to set some boundaries around. I think a lot of the times that there can be an assumption that youth peer support specialists should share their entire story, but that might not always be in the best interest for the young person, and it might not always be the best protective measure for the youth peer support specialist. So a really helpful supervision tactic for that is to remind your youth peer support specialist that strategic sharing does not necessarily need to involve answering every question that a young adult, a parent, or a professional might have. It really is just about sharing those key pieces of their story that help provide that piece of hope. Generally, pieces of this story include things like what have they done within their recovery, what has recovery looked like for them, how did they use certain tools in order to approach their recovery process, and things of that nature. It doesn't need to be things like rehashing trauma, particularly if that is not something that is relevant for the youth. So as supervisors, I encourage you, have these conversations with your youth peer support specialists, not necessarily asking them to share their story with you, but asking them what are some of the key pieces of your story that you think are relevant and safe to share, and how can we help you sort of hone that in. There's some really good tools, on Pathways to Positive Futures website, one of them being a strategic sharing workbook, which again is free to access as well as the tool that we have here. Another piece of what youth peer supports do is individualized support. And I know that this is something that is very emblematic of all of the work that we do, because everybody that we're working with is different. So youth peer support specialists should be especially adept at helping young people really figure out what it is that they need to do. There's a lot of good trainings around this that really encourage youth peer support specialists as well as other professionals to sort of shy away from inserting their own opinion and make sure that they're using conversational tactics in order to really provide that individualized support. Because again, what might work for one young person isn't going to work for another. A good example I have of this is I was working with a staff member who, as a part of their own experience, had a very, very successful time with dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, and they were working with a lot of young people who were also either accessing this resource or thinking about doing so. And because they had had such a successful experience as such, would often use this as a recommendation for their young people. So this is coming out of the best intentions, right? But one thing that we had to really cover was this something that they felt was best for the young person, or that the young person felt like was best for them? So rather than making these recommendations, unless the young person was specifically requesting a recommendation, we talked about some conversational tactics that they could use in order to get the youth to brainstorm some of their own resources, some of the own things that they would like to try, maybe in addition to or in replacement of DBT. So that's something I would say is really important to work with your youth peer support specialists on as a supervisor. And one of the best ways to do this is to reflect these practices within your own supervision. As I mentioned, there are also a number of trainings around this. It will likely happen in the peer certification that young people are getting. However, sort of a more advanced training around this, we do host at Portland State University. It's called Achieve My Plan Plus, or AMP Plus as we call it, and it really coaches youth peer support specialists on how to engage youth in creating their own plans and individualized support. Maria, is there anything that you would add to any of these pieces?
I think you did a really great job covering all of those. Just in terms of strategic sharing, I think just helping the staff that you're working with set boundaries and consider what purpose do they want to achieve with sharing their story in different settings and just considering that they're going to be asked to share their story maybe in team meetings, maybe in doing advocacy or sitting on committees and councils, and just really working to prepare them for that ahead of time, just so they don't feel put on the spot and forced to share more than they're ready for, because I know that has happened, well, both to me and a lot of staff that I have worked with. So really working with the staff to preempt that and make sure they are ready to answer any questions that might come up around their story, because peers can tend to be put on the spot when people find out their peers to share maybe more than they really would like to share about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, do you have an example about that?
Yeah, I know I was doing a presentation on substance abuse resources in the county I was working on, and it was really just about resources available, but since I was a peer support supervisor, I mentioned, we do peer support, and as I'm a person in recovery, that can be a great resource to connect with young people. And somebody just asked me, well, I wonder if you could share your own recovery story, which I thought was kind of an inappropriate question, but at the time, I didn't really feel prepared, to set that boundary, and I was speaking in front of, 100 people, so I gave kind of a truncated version of my own story, but afterward I had to sit down with my supervisor and say, how should I handle that when that happens, and ended up coming up with some phrases I could say, well, I don't really feel comfortable sharing that right now, but if I were talking to a youth, here's some things I would share, or something along those lines. But I think if you're not prepared, it can be really easy to say more than you would like to and then leave feeling a little bit too vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it's a good example as well of how sometimes youth peers can be tokenized as people with lived experience. And it's really our job as supervisors to help make sure that they recognize when things like that are happening, and that it's definitely okay for them to say that they're not comfortable and set those boundaries. Because as part of youth peer support is also making sure that we're sort of releasing some of the stigma around what it's like to be somebody with lived experience in child serving systems.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so here are some other items that peer supports do. Peer supports create shared understanding with the young people they work with. So this kind of goes along with the other pieces we were talking about. But this goes along with creating empathy. So peer supports draw on their own experiences to relate to the young people. This is a great way to build trust with young people. A lot of the young people that are accessing peer support might be what we call system wary. They may have a lot of experiences in the system, and they may have been bad experiences, right? So they might not be very trusting of normal providers. So peer support specialists, by being able to talk about things that the young people they're working with can relate to, can kind of open up that shared understanding and help the young person see, okay, maybe this service can be different, right? By building that shared understanding, that's when the young person is going to start to open up, build rapport, and maybe be able to start working on some of that goal building and stuff that we ultimately want to be doing with the young people we're working with. Affirmation is another big one. Validating the things the young people are going through. This also draws on having the shared lived experience as well. And affirming the perspective that the young person has for things. This is especially important, I think, within wraparound, and maybe you can speak to this too, Caitlin, but I think within a team setting, young people can often feel like they are very alone and that nobody really understands their point of view. So I think the peer support specialist often comes in and can be that voice that affirms and advocates for the young person's point of view. Relationship building, that's a big one, of course. I think mutuality and relationship is one of the pillars of peer support in general. and youth peer support, of course, is no exception. That shared connection between youth peers is really the basis on which most of the other work of youth peer support is able to happen, right? So when youth peers are able to build relationships with young people, it kind of also helps model for them maybe different skills they can use to build relationships and access support in other areas of their lives as well. And then normalization, again with the shared understanding and affirmation pieces, this is just another way to help the young person feel less isolated in their experiences, especially their experiences of the systems or their mental health challenges. The peer support specialist, even if they don't have the exact same experiences as the young person, can really help them feel that these experiences are normal. You know, you're not wrong or broken for having these experiences, and that can really go a long way and is a different kind of service, obviously, than a clinical service or most of the systems services that young people are used to having. Do you want to add anything on any of these, Caitlin?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you did a really good job covering these. And I think especially when we're thinking about things, I've got a couple of anecdotes, I think, but the shared understanding was one that really stood out to me when I first became a peer support specialist, because as a early and a new peer, I sort of assumed that I was only going to be working with young people who had my shared lived experience. And learned quickly that that was not the case. I was going to be working with young people where maybe we had different experiences and things of that nature. And so I had a supervisor who really worked with me on some of those pieces of how do you find maybe not necessarily the shared experience, but the shared understanding of what it feels like to be a part of these systems. One young person that I worked with, so when we first started working together, I was really nervous because they were an older male. They had grown up in foster care, and that was not my experience. And so I was primarily at the time working with older teenage girls and also working with women who had mental health challenges and who had survived sexual assault trauma. And so I was thinking like, oh, how am I going to be able to well support this youth? This is a young person who I feel like we ended up actually doing a lot of that relationship building, had a lot of shared feelings around experiences on being in systems. And working with him, he was really able to become, I think, a better advocate for himself and for other young people who were living in the child welfare system through having a youth peer support specialist. So I really encourage you when you're working with your staff, if they're working with a young person where maybe they don't have the same lived experience, either because you might have limited peer support specialists, which is totally typical, or something of that nature, that you help them really focus on that shared understanding and the relationship building piece.
Yeah, I think that's a really great. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no. Also, when we're talking about relationship building, it's really important, I think, to highlight with staff that not every young person is going to think that you're like the most awesome thing right away. That always made me so nervous that you still kind of have that feeling from high school, like, are they going to think I'm cool factor? And that's okay. It's totally normal to be a little bit nervous about whether or not your young people are going to like you. So I would affirm with your staff that, you know, you don't build relationships in a day. Sometimes you'll meet young people that you totally click with, and then sometimes you meet young people where because they've been involved in the systems, as Maria has said, they're system weary and they're used to people sort of rotating in and out of their lives. So really that unconditional and persistent piece, like we talk about in wraparound, is super important for those youth. And it doesn't mean that you need to, you know, be blowing them up or hitting up their phone every day, but just consistently showing them that you're going to show up will make huge strides in that relationship building piece. So as supervisors, I would just affirm that with your staff and affirm with them that it's okay if not everybody likes you right away, and it takes a little bit to build on those relationships. It's also okay when you're building those relationships, I think, to sort of take things out of the professional realm. This is where the youth part of the youth peer support piece is really important, and focus on the peerness piece. And so peerness doesn't need to just be, oh, we have shared lived experience or shared trauma. It can be, we have a shared cultural understanding of what young people are into. So are they going and playing video games together? Are they going to a drop-in center together and playing pool? Like, what are the fun things that they're doing together in order for this to feel like a mutual relationship that involves respect rather than a hierarchical relationship? And then one other thing that I want to add with affirmation isn't just about affirming sort of maybe where the youth fit is, how they're feeling or where they're coming from. Affirmation can get into sort of, I think, some sticky situations that as supervisors it's important for us to support our youth peer supports with. So I know an example that I have, when I was a supervisor for a youth peer support specialist who was working with a youth in wraparound, this young person wanted it to explore sex work, which I know is a very yikesy, very taboo topic. And I myself worked with youth who had these sort of ideas as well. And it wasn't the youth peer support specialist's job, we'll get into this, to tell them, no, absolutely not, that's not something that you can do, because then the young person would have just sort of written them off and not spoken to them, right? So I really had to work with the youth peer support specialist based off of my own experience with youth peer support, working with similar youth, on how do we adequately communicate this to the team? How do we make sure that we're communicating it in a way that highlights the young person's other goals? So this youth, I forget specifically what it was, but this was a strategy that they were identifying in order to raise up money for something else, right? So there was a higher need there that the youth peer support specialist was able to uncover through asking some of these open-ended questions and having some of that individualized support strategies. And we were able to bring it to the team in a way that felt like, A, the youth was still being heard, but B, we were approaching sort of this idea in a way that didn't feel punitive to the young person, so that they would be open to other ideas and the team could focus on what the larger goal at hand was. So affirmation sometimes can get into, like I said, these taboo topics, and as supervisors, it's our job to make sure that our youth peer support specialists aren't necessarily saying, like, no, you can't do that, but they're helping identify the underlying need. They're also making sure that the youth's voice is heard, and they're making sure that the youth is able to brainstorm maybe alternative or safe strategies with their team members in a way that feels effective. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Maria?
Nope, you covered it.
All right. My slides are not advancing. Can I ask one of our wonderful administrators to help me with that?
Let's see.
Hi, Caitlin. We are actually advancing. Could you do me a favor and look at the bottom right-hand corner of your slide pod and press on the sync button? It should be dark gray. We just want to make sure that you're on the same page. Okay, so we are on slide 8 right now.
Well, I see the sync button, but it doesn't happen to be working for me. Maybe it's something with my connection. Maria, do you want to go ahead and take over slide 8, and I'll add things in as needed? Oh, wait, it just synced. Okay, boom, boom. Thanks, everybody.
We're good. Okay, so here are some things that it is not the peer support specialist's job to do. First of all, it is not your job as a peer support specialist to be a superhero. We did add that you can wear a cape because, you know, things come up. We might have a superhero-themed party. You might want to wear a cape, right? However, it's not a peer support specialist's job to jump in and be the person handling every single crisis. It also shouldn't be an expectation that once a peer support specialist joins the team or joins a young person's treatment plan, then everything's going to be solved, right? That's a lot of expectation to put on the youth peer support specialist. So in terms of handling a crisis, it's important that there's a safety plan in place so that everything doesn't fall on the youth peer support specialist, because though the young person is probably going to call the youth peer support specialist when they're in crisis because they have such a good relationship, the youth peer support specialist is going to get burnt out pretty fast if that's happening every time. So it's important that, they're able to take some time off and do some self-care, and that there are other supports in place. It's also important in terms of thinking of a youth peer support specialist as, a superhero or messianic figure, that they shouldn't be expected to represent perfection. A youth peer support specialist is human, and recovery is a process, right? So they're not like a perfectly recovered figure, right? And we wouldn't want them to be. It's important for a youth peer support specialist to be honest about, when things are difficult, that life doesn't just become perfect after, you figure out your mental health struggles. So they're not expected to represent perfection, and they need to demonstrate the fact that recovery is an ongoing process with the young people you work with. And as a supervisor, I think that's something that's important to communicate with your staff, and we'll go over this a little bit more in the self-care and burnout sections later, I think. Another important thing, which I think we have touched on a little bit throughout this presentation so far, is that it's not the youth peer support specialist's role to tell the young person what to do. So they shouldn't be making suggestions, giving advice, outright just telling a young person to do or not do something. Unfortunately, this can be an expectation that is put on a youth peer support specialist by other adults in the young person's life, people on their team, their parents, their therapists. Sometimes because the peer support specialist is so close and has that kind of more peer-like relationship with the young person, other people on the team might think, oh, well, we want the young person to do A, B, or C, so you peer support specialist, you can get them to do this, right? But that would really compromise the peer relationship, right? So it's important that the youth peer support specialist is instead working with the young person to figure out what they want to do. And as a supervisor, if you're encountering these kind of issues happening with your youth peer support specialist, this is where it's important to help them clarify their role with other team members. Also, as a supervisor, you can kind of also be that person to step in and advocate for role clarity for them. The youth peer support specialist is not a therapist. This is what makes the role appealing to young people, right? Because it's different from the more clinical systems-y stuff that they might be used to. Young people can be pretty averse to what we call therapizing or like therapy speak. So it's important that youth peers kind of stay away from that kind of language. It's also important to remember that youth peers don't have the clinical training to be making decisions for the young person. So youth peer support specialists can be a bridge to clinical support and to therapy if that's what the young person identifies as something they'd like to try out, but they're not a therapist, and they're certainly not a mini therapist or somebody that the therapist can use to kind of help carry out their own program. Also, the youth peer support specialist is not there to be a spokesperson for the young person. Especially on something like a wraparound team, it's important that, for example, like if the youth is not able to make a meeting and the youth peers there, you don't just count that as having youth voice, you know. They're there to help the young person identify what kind of things they might like to say and plan for how they'll communicate, but they are not there to speak for the young person. So, Caitlin, do you have some examples you want to throw in here?
Yeah, so I know, as you mentioned, for being the youth spokesperson, yeah, a lot of the time youth peer support is seen as sort of a supplement for the youth voice, and we really want to make sure that that's not the case. Additionally, I often found that maybe other professionals or team members would ask me, like, oh, I know that you saw the youth on Tuesday, what's going on with them? And that's really something, as a supervisor, you want to help your youth peer support specialist come up with certain phrases to redirect folks to maybe communicate with the young person directly, or I'll additionally come up with phrases that really highlight sort of the confidentiality of your role, but that you still want to be a cooperative member of the team, so you'll check in with the youth about what can be shared and what can't be shared. That's something that I think it comes up a lot, and again, it's out of everybody's best intentions and curiosity, right? But as supervisors, I would really help prepare your youth peer support specialist to be put in that situation. Additionally, with the superhero piece, I think that pops up a lot. I know that for myself as a youth peer support specialist and as a supervisor for youth peer support specialists, you feel a lot of urgency to go in and save young people who are in crisis. So you really have to be very, very clear about what staff can and cannot do. An example that I saw come up frequently as a supervisor was youth who are being kicked out of their homes, whether that be a foster home or a home with a family member or something of that nature. And sometimes the urge for a youth peer support specialist would just be to go and pick them up right away. That is definitely going to lead to burnout on their part, and what it's going to do is teach the young person that the youth peer support specialist is the crisis manager. An alternative is making sure that they know what resources youth can access. Maybe they can give them a ride to a crisis shelter or something of that nature, but there needs to be a plan for that in place rather than just doing sort of a very reactive response. So working with your youth peer support specialists on some proactive situations or proactive resources for when things like that happen. One thing that I would do as a supervisor is we would host coaching sessions with our RAP peer support staff every other week and sort of propose that one or more of these scenarios where something would come up in the superhero category and how people could handle that alternatively rather than reacting in a very, I think, hasty way. So a couple of other things. Oh, go for it, Maria.
Okay. So a few more that are not the role of the youth peer support specialist. Being the star. So this kind of goes back to the strategic sharing piece, right? In that sharing your own story should be strategic, right? So when you're sharing, you don't want to share things that you're uncomfortable with, and similarly, you don't want to share so much that you are overshadowing the youth or making your session all about you. You want to make sure that as a youth peer support specialist, you are going to be sharing things that are relevant and effective in terms of, you know, doing those other things that youth peer support specialists want to be doing, building relationship, affirming, normalizing, and, you know, not comparing every experience the youth has back to you. I'm sure we've all had friends who do that in conversations, right? It's probably even worse if a youth peer support specialist does it. So as a supervisor, that should probably be another piece of the conversation around strategic sharing, is just what kind of things are you comfortable with sharing, but also how can you share your story in a way that is going to be maximally helpful for the young person? Here are two things that are often asked of youth peer support specialists that are not asked of other professionals, and that is babysitting and chauffeuring of young people. So this can often come from pretty burnt out parents who see a youth peer support specialist, coming to pick up their young person, are like, oh, great, this is an opportunity for me to maybe get some time to myself or get some errands done. Or they want to make sure that, well, the young person is with the youth peer support specialist, that they're not, getting into any trouble. So they might give the youth peer support specialist some instructions like, hey, while you're with my child, make sure he doesn't, do A, B, or C. So we really want to be clear about the fact that this would also kind of be damaging to the peer relationship if the youth peer is tasked with supervising or babysitting the young person. Similarly, it's not the job of the youth peer to be chauffeuring young people around. They should not be expected to be the primary source of transportation. This can be an ask by other providers and the parents, but it can also be something that young people ask of you. I know I experienced this a lot in the drop-in center just because young people thought of me as a pushover and thought that I would give them a lot of rides. But I had to realize, I'm not helping them build self-determination skills to get themselves home on their own when I'm, not going to be around to give them rides anymore. So really working with my staff and with myself to help them, plan, well, I'm not able to give you a ride tonight. How else are you able to get home? Helping them brainstorm how can they take the bus, looking up bus routes, that kind of thing, was an effective solution that we found to get around that. But I do want to highlight that these are things that are not asked of other professionals, so they should not be asked of youth peers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think it's important, too, what Maria mentioned about the self-determination skills. So we're really doing a disservice when we expect youth peers to do things like be a babysitter or be the expected chauffeur, because what we're doing is we're filling in a gap that needs to be filled in by natural support, community support, things of that nature, right? So once a youth peer isn't working with the youth anymore, that's going to be a service that won't be available to them if they've been regularly driving or supervising the young person. So I think as supervisors, it's really important that we help youth peers think of alternative options to conceptualize that, while also really highlighting how are they helping youth build self-determination skills, like taking public transit, or like maybe accessing some after-school or community activities if they have a lot of free time. That said, it's not that youth peers can never drive, right? Or if it so happens that a youth peer is going to be meeting with a youth and a guardian uses that time to go grocery shopping. It's not the end of the world, but this shouldn't be the consistent expectation of a youth peer.
All right, two more. What is not youth peer support? Youth peer support specialists should not be friends with the young people they work with. This can be a tough one, right? Because youth peer support specialists, like we said, are near peers to the youth they're working with, meaning they're usually close in age, and they're building relationships with the young people based on trust, mutual respect, shared experiences. Those are all some ingredients that go into friendship, right? However, it's important to highlight that because of, the ethical boundaries and professionalism, that they're not friends. So, and there are certain things that youth peers do that friends wouldn't do, and vice versa. So how can you, as a supervisor, kind of help your staff draw those boundaries with young people, because, you know, it's probably going to happen at some point. I've had staff that I supervise come to me and said, you know, this youth told me that I'm his best friend. Like, how do I handle that? I think the best way to do it is to be kind of proactive about it, and at the first meeting really highlight those things that are specific to your role that are professional, such as like mandatory reporting, you know, your ethical responsibilities like that, and then really have your staff able to have some phrases ready to say for when those things come up, like, oh, I really like hanging out with you too, you know, and then try to have a conversation with your staff to identify, you know, is there a need behind your young person saying this? Do they lack natural supports and friends? But this is definitely a boundary issue that most likely will come up with youth peer support specialists. And then similarly to kind of what we were talking about with babysitting, it's not the youth peer support specialist role to police the young person. They are there to help the young person identify their goals, right, to support them in achieving them, but they're not there to tell the young person what to do or what not to do, or to make sure they don't do certain things that their parents or their team wouldn't like to see them do. This can get tough because if a young person does do something that the parents don't approve of, the youth peer support specialist might hear about it, right? I know me and Caitlin were working with a staff that had been walking around the mall doing peer support with her young person, and the young person was going to buy a pair of socks that had marijuana leaves on them. And, you know, the peer support said, well, how do you think your mom is going to react to this when you get them? Great open-ended question to help her think of the consequences. And she said, I don't care, I'm going to get them anyway. Well, she got them, and the mom ended up calling the peer support specialist and said, why did you let my daughter buy these while she was with you? But I think that the staff handled it really well by helping the young person think through the consequences of, you know, what will happen. How, is your mom going to like this, you know, without jumping in and policing the actions and ultimately letting the young person make that decision herself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it is about helping, again, those young people build self-determination skills. Additionally, with the policing youth, it's not the youth peer support specialist job to, quote-unquote, tell on the young person, right? Mm-hmm. It's more their job to help them think of effective strategies to communicate with their team members. So, for instance, I know I was supervising a staff one time who was working with a young person who was on parole and was obviously not supposed to be using drugs. They shouldn't be doing that anyway. But smoked marijuana, told the staff member about it, and the staff came up with a plan for them to share that with their parole officer and with their team, rather than going behind the young person's back and just like ratting them out, so to speak. And that was a much more effective way in the long run, too, for the young people to be working with some of the gatekeepers and some of the caregivers in their life. So as a supervisor, helping to make sure that your staff has some of these strategies to help young people really plan and effectively communicate with their team members is very, very key.
Okay, so let's jump into supportive supervision tactics. Structure, self-care, and transparency. So supervision can look a little bit different with youth peer support specialists, or at least we think that it should. Often when we think of supervision, we think of disciplinary action, check-ins, and productivity. When we think of best practices for supervision with youth peer support specialists, we want to focus more on transparency and self-care. So these are the 4 things that supervision with youth peer support specialists should be. It should be consistent, and that also should include it being regular, ideally on the same day of the week or every other week and at the same time. It should be strengths-based, goal-oriented, and promote alliance. Sorry, we did it at the same time.
Okay.
We're good now. So it's important to ensure that all supervision meetings are recorded in some way. This could be video. It could just be taking notes in writing on your computer, and then it's always good to email those notes back out to your staff so you both have a copy. I just had a shared Google document of my supervision notes that me and my staff both had access to, and then, you know, I'd always say, please let me know if I missed anything from this and we can change it. Supervision should focus on strength and skill enhancement opportunities, enough to highlight genuine strengths and avoid the pit of awesome. So when we say the pit of awesome, this is something we also talk about when talking about strengths with young people. This means that we're doing descriptive praise and actually talking about strengths in a genuine way instead of just saying, that's great, that's awesome, that's cool, you know, over and over again using generic phrases, right? Because that can come off as pretty fake. So we want to be modeling for our youth peer support staff what having a genuine conversation about strengths really looks like, because they're going to be able to take that strengths-based approach and use it with their young people. And then in terms of skill enhancement, we should be providing our youth peer support staff with opportunities for future training or advancement, and these should always be followed up with supportive coaching to reinforce any skills that are built. Okay, I'm going to click it this time. So supervision meetings should always be transparent, no surprises. If you're going to, you know, be discussing something that might be potentially difficult or disciplinary action, it's probably best to let the young person that you're supervising know that ahead of time. More trauma-informed practice. Any potential issues should be clearly documented in past supervision recordings. And then expectations and mistakes can often be framed as learning opportunities and can help you frame a supportive work environment for your staff. It's also really important to keep in mind that for many youth peer support specialists, this is their first professional role. I know that was the case for many of the staff that I worked with. I know for myself, I had never heard of youth peer support before I took my role as a youth peer support specialist. And a lot of people kind of stumble onto the role by accident, right? One strategy we even used for hiring was sneaking it into like the food service section in Craigslist, because people don't know that this is something they can be doing when they have lived experience. So it's important to be cognizant of that, that not only because of age, but because of things like lived experience and the fact that they might be coming from a totally different industry. Youth peer support specialists might not be prepared for some of the demands of the job, like entering case notes and things like that. So they may need guidance for things such as composing emails, keeping a complex schedule, planning ahead. I know I've had staff that didn't really understand how to use Google Suite, and it's important not to, you know, make assumptions about what people do and do not know how to do. It's also important that staff are made aware of their rights and responsibilities in the workplace and trained on that within HR when they first come on. So as far as supportive supervision goes, it's important to assume that people are doing the best they can, and to come at any issues that staff is having from more of a curious and collaborative approach than a disciplinary one, right? So here's an example. If you have a staff that has been coming on time, but suddenly starts showing up late to meetings, rather than immediately jumping into, okay, how are we going to start the disciplinary process, you should start a conversation to help identify the need. And kind of think about this as like a collaborative problem-solving approach, right? You want to open it up with a non-judgmental observation. I've noticed that you've been late to work recently, and usually you're on time. Is there something going on? And, you might find out something you weren't expecting. Maybe the staff is burnt out. Maybe they have something going on. But it's important not to be immediately punitive. And then in the youth peer support role, there often is room to identify creative strategies, such as working from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. instead of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., especially because a lot of youth peer work happens after 3 p.m. when young people get out of school anyways.
Mm-hmm. And something that I think is important, too, is as you're using that strengths-based approach to really help identify the need, you're modeling for your staff what you want them to be doing with the young people that they're working with.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a balance, of course, between making those accommodations and keeping your staff accountable. And being strengths-based does not mean not holding youth peer support staff accountable. We don't want to act like, we definitely don't want to fall into a trap of, oh, peers can't be held to the same standards as everyone else, right? Because that is incredibly stigmatizing. This is a professional role, and it should be treated as such. So if youth peer support specialists do not improve after consistent coaching and supervision, then disciplinary action should be taken. I was like, when I was a youth peer support specialist supervisor, to, put regular check-in times. So, okay, we'll check in on this after 6 months or whatever for improvement. Usually it would be shorter than that, but that's a good way to build some accountability into your supervision. But your agency should have a clear process about what your disciplinary escalation is, and that should be pretty transparent for staff. All right, I'll hand it over to Caitlin.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about promoting self-care, which I see that we have a question about that in the box, so hopefully we can help with a little bit of that, but we'll definitely address that after the presentation as well. So, as I hope most of us know, self-care is not just taking bubble baths, but if you want to do that, I totally encourage you to do so. So in addition to work-related strengths and needs, supervision should have a focus on self-care. So this can be uncomfortable to talk about, and I do understand we're probably a lot of agencies that would want to keep some boundaries around this, so hopefully we'll help you identify some creative strategies. However, youth peer support often feels they might not need self-care or that they don't deserve self-care. I know that I have supervised a lot of staff who think that they can take on the world, or they think that they're not doing enough, so self-care isn't a priority. This should not be the case. It's really important that we help the staff understand that taking care of themselves is going to allow them to take care of their youth. So it's important, if you can, to be transparent about the fact that you want to create a brief self-care plan. This is easiest to do when your agency supports a culture of self-care. So for instance, the agency that Maria and I worked for, it was definitely an expectation that supervisors would be checking in with their staff about this. Now, it doesn't mean that we're therapists, right, or taking clinical notes or anything, but it means that it's a regular part of the conversation to check in with each other about what's something nice that you're doing for yourself today. So rather than making suggestions or checking boxes, quote unquote, to help them identify some things for self-care, use open-ended questions to help promote that alliance piece that we talked about earlier, right? So checking in with them about what they like to do, who they can rely on, what's a healthy routine for them. So for instance, I know in speaking with Maria, Maria really likes cross-stitch. Now, I don't necessarily need to write that down as a part of a self-care plan, but maybe if I notice that Maria is feeling stressed out, I can be like, hey, have you done any cross-stitching lately? You can check in about it in a conversational and really promote that rapport way. So I always like to start each supervision by asking, what are you doing for self-care this week? Sometimes that's not always the best strategy. It actually turned into like a joke with my staff where they would catch me on it before I would say it. They'd be like, oh, Caitlin, what are you doing for self-care this week? Which, I mean, I think people still enjoy being asked, but you can ask in a multitude of ways. Make sure that you're remembering what your staff says, though, and check in with them about it during their supervision. So, for instance, if I had a staff who would tell me, oh, well, I'm going to go to the coast and visit my relative, I might ask them during the next supervision, how was your visit to the coast? This might be awkward at first, but keep it conversational, and it's really good for building that alliance with your youth peer support specialist, too, which is something that as supervisors we want to make sure that we're doing so that when something comes up with their young people that they need to check in about, they feel safe in doing so. And again, this is important for normalizing self-care for your staff within your agency. I think that youth peer supports are not the only people who need self-care, right? We all need self-care sometimes. And so it can be really supportive if within our agency we're talking about things like, what are we doing to promote our own well-being? I think it's also important to normalize with staff members that self-care isn't about just luxury. Sometimes self-care sucks. It can be hard. Like a part of my self-care was waking up at 6 a.m. today to go on a run. I was not thrilled to do that, but I'm glad that I did because it made me a more productive person for the rest of the day, right? So sometimes self-care is really about routine, having skills-based practice for one's mental health, making sure that you're making appointments. So I would really highlight it's important that your agency allows for things like mental health days or flexible work schedules. The reason being, too, is we know with peers that oftentimes we're hiring people who might need to access a certain service that's only available during the work weekday, and we want to make sure that they have the availability and the freedom to do that. One example that I have, so I was supervising a staff member who, unbeknownst to me, was suffering from a pretty serious medical issue and was working from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. every Monday through Friday. It was really stressful for them because they couldn't get in to see the doctor unless it was really early in the morning. Luckily, we were able to talk about it, and rather than them having to wake up super early to go to the doctor and then go to a stressful job at work and be having some physical suffering during the day, we worked it out where they were working 4/10s so they could work Monday through Thursday and then have Friday in order to really address some of those needs that were going unmet. And they ended up doing better work. They were feeling a lot better. It was a way that not only was able to promote their own self-care, but also to promote them being to better able to serve their young people. So it was a win-win for everybody. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, sort of related to self-care, is recognizing burnout and vicarious trauma. Before we move on, Maria, is there anything that you want to add about self-care?
Nope.
Okie doke, artichoke. So before we jump into the vicarious trauma and burnout discussion, I want to be very transparent about something, modeling those supervision strategies. I often think that the vicarious trauma piece and the burnout piece, unfortunately, is not always an if, but a when. This is a really high-demand job, and it's a very unique role where we're asking people to literally share their past traumas in order to sufficiently do their job, which is why the self-care piece is really important. Supportive supervision is really important. But I think also being able to recognize the signs of vicarious trauma and burnout is important, and being upfront with your staff about there are going to be things that are going to be hard. Not every day it's not every day that you're going to go home and feel like the day went really well, right? There are going to be some times when you go home and you're scared. There are going to be some times when you go home and you're triggered. There are going to be some times when you go home and you don't know what the next day is going to look like. So it's really important that we're addressing some of these things head on with staff and that they know what to expect within their role. So vicarious trauma occurs when youth peer support specialists are consistently hearing stories of trauma and pain that fellow survivors have endured. This can be compounded by the fact that they might share lived experience with youth who are sharing these stories with them. This is a really unique role in the fact that you're expected to share parts of your own story, which can also lead to vicarious trauma. So signs of vicarious trauma are going to be different amongst each person, but some common signs might include intrusive thoughts or dreams about clients, a lack of sleep or poor eating habits, feeling jumpy or panicky, and feelings of hopelessness or lack of self-worth. I think it's important that while these are common signs, we want to be making sure that we're checking in with our staff to see if there are any other signs that they might be noticing. So for instance, an example that I have from my own experience, as a youth peer support specialist, I did a emergency response to a school shooting that happened here in Oregon about 3 years ago. And we were there for about 2 weeks, and then for a year, on and off, I was going maybe once or twice a week to support students who had been survivors of this school shooting. And I thought that I was fine. I was handling it. Things are cool. And my supervisor was checking in with me about what I was doing in my free time. And I shared with them, I was like, well, I'm basically just rewatching the same episodes of 30 Rock and Parks and Rec over and over and over again. And they're like, okay, is that a normal pattern for you? And I said, no, but I'm just feeling, really tired and don't have the energy for anything. And that's when they helped me recognize that that might be a symptom of vicarious trauma, and that would be something that I might need to address either with my therapist or take some time off. But I think it's important to, again, model these open-ended questions for staff so that they can openly and honestly share some of these things. So rather than saying things, like, are you having intrusive thoughts or dreams, really just asking about what they're recognizing their patterns might be, particularly if you know that they're dealing with a particularly difficult situation with a youth that they're working with or something else of that nature. So we want to make sure to make the distinction between vicarious trauma and burnout, but some of the signs are very similar. So burnout is generally mental and emotional exhaustion that is due to ongoing stress. So this can just be the stress of any job, right? Everybody gets burnt out at some point or another. But I think that burnout can happen in particular when we have youth peer support specialists who are maybe spending a lot of time with one particular client, or they are maybe strategically sharing their story a little bit too much, or maybe they're just overwhelmed with clientele as well. Something that I saw very frequently within wraparound is that it seemed like when it rained, it poured. All of a sudden, we would get a bunch of referrals, and you would have a youth peer support specialist who went from working with 5 youth to 18 youth, and it just feels very overwhelming. So thinking about how we're handling some of those scenarios as they come up as well is really important, and making sure that we're not overloading our youth peer support staff unless they feel supported to do so. So again, due to the nature of this role, burnout is pretty common. The role is not only demanding due to working with youth who might be struggling, but the hours can be demanding, and it feels like there's no off switch. So what we mean by that is I know that for myself and for a lot of my staff, frequently there were days where you would start your mornings with committee or council meetings, that you would go to consultations with the other professionals in your group and other team members. You would then maybe have 3, 4, or 5 one-on-ones with youth. In the interim, you're spending a lot of time on the road, and the day all in all in itself might be, 12 to 16 hours, and then you get home and you have a young person who calls you in crisis. So in order to mitigate some of these, I think it's really important in supervision that you're having conversations with your staff about things like, when are you telling youth that you turn off your phone? Are you reachable past certain hours? If not, where are areas that they can call? Things of that nature. Because, again, we really found that as youth peer support specialists and as supervisors that usually the youth peer support specialist was the first person that the young person was calling in the line of fire. So you want to make sure that you as a supervisor are helping your young person or helping the young person who's working for you set those boundaries in order to help mitigate some of the burnout or prevent some of the burnout. Again, it's really important that we're being transparent with our young adult staff. So if you're noticing some signs of burnout or vicarious trauma, it's okay to say that. This can relate to poor work performance, such as showing up late, not scheduling meetings with youth, avoiding calls or emails. So this also really relates to that strengths-based supervision piece. So rather than jumping immediately into disciplinary action, saying, hey, I noticed that you haven't been doing as many one-on-ones with youth lately. Are you feeling some signs of burnout? Is a way that you can help support them in maintaining their role, connecting with their young person, and making sure that you're going to have a happy and healthy staff member doing good work with their youth. So some steps that you might want to take in this situation is reviewing their self-care plan, seeing if there are any changes that they need to make or if there's certain things that are no longer working for them, reviewing and acknowledging any triggers or signs of burnout, really normalizing what they might be experiencing. We notice that a lot of youth peer supports who are not working within a youth peer agency feel like they might be stigmatized if they come forward with struggling. We want to make sure that we're not telling them like, well, you're not ready for this role. We're normalizing this with them, coming up with action steps before we're immediately jumping into, again, disciplinary action or telling them that they might not be ready. And then you want to check in with your staff about what they can do to support themselves, who can support them, and possibly what you or your agency have the capacity to do in order to support them through this time as well. Some resources that your agency might be able to offer include mental health days and FMLA, in-house counseling services, a flexible or a pared-down work schedule, and then revisiting and clarifying any boundaries. So again, an example might be, when do they turn off their work phone in the evening? Do they turn off their phone on the weekends? And if so, who can youth reach out to? How often are they visiting with some youth, or do they need to set certain boundaries around that? I know I worked with one staff member who was working with a young person who really wanted to be there for them, really wanted to support them, but found that every time they spent time with this young person just felt really drained afterwards. So what we did is we created a plan where after they saw that young person each week, and they would usually end their day with that young person, no more one-on-one. They would just go home or do some admin work or something of that nature. And that was really a good strategy where they were still able to support that young person but not have to feel stressed or drained by the end of the day. They knew that they could just go home and take care of themselves. Maria, do you have anything to add before we turn it over to questions?
No, I think we can turn over to questions now. We've got about 15 minutes.
So, Allison, are you going to be leading the questions for us, or would you like me to do so? Okay.
So if you want to, you can read the question from the presenter's chat, or Jasmine or myself can moderate for you.
Okay, I can go ahead and read it from the presenter's chat. So it looks like we have a question, and it says that folks are finding one of our youth peers that is using several colleagues around the organization as a sounding board for personal problems. We've discussed our employee assistance program, and the youth has full-time medical benefits. Our HR department has disallowed us from discussing self-care and supervision, asking us to supervise peers as we would any other professional employee. Struggling for ideas to address status of youth mental health and providing more direct conversation around ways to address. I think that this often comes up, thank you for asking, because this comes up a lot, I think especially with agencies that aren't youth peer focused. And I would say that it's okay for us to ask questions that might relate to self-care that aren't mental health specific. So questions don't necessarily need to be, how are you feeling about your mental health, but more, what are you doing to take care of yourself? I also might talk to HR to get some clarity around the policy around discussing self-care or being able to utilize time off or things of that nature. And I might use the opportunity for some coaching for the youth peer around how do we maybe act professionally with others in the office. So remembering that this might be, again, their first job in a professional setting and that they're not super used to setting some of those personal boundaries that we might have, and allowing that as a learning opportunity for them. And doing it in a transparent but strengths-based way. So it's okay, I think, to say, this is maybe some of the feedback that I'm hearing, normalize that, you know, it's okay for them to want to connect with their coworkers, but then talking a little bit about what maybe some other outlets might be. Maria, what's your feedback on that situation?
I think that's good feedback. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think that's great.
Excellent. Well, would you like to take on this one? So our next question is ideas for tech tools and resources or recommendations on working with peer supports and leaders remotely.
Sure. I'm guessing this is more relevant than ever in our current situation. So the great thing is that I know that SAMHSA is not pursuing any HIPAA violations right now during coronavirus, so that takes a lot of the stress out. But some of the tech tools that we have used in our organization, texting, I think the best way to do that is for every youth peer support specialist to have their own phone provided by the agency. That just helps keep things more secure, and as well as keep good boundaries between the young person and the youth peer support specialist. And there's also different tools and apps that the agency can put in place to have varying degrees of control over the phone and what information they can have access to. We've also had our staff have Facebook accounts specifically for work, which have been a great way to connect with young people. Being able to see what young people are posting can be a really good window into their mental health state, right? And we were able to catch a lot of posts that were red flags for suicide and actually did a lot of suicide interventions over Facebook chats. I know that a lot of people are using Microsoft TeamViewer right now to do like telehealth. And then I think like it can also be fun to just do like games or like videos back and forth with your young people, just because I know if I were working with young people, I'd probably be having a lot of complaints right now about not being able to meet in person, so trying to find some things to keep it a little more fun while we're all going through, you know, this kind of new normal. Do you have anything to add, Caitlin?
I think that those are all great suggestions. I know in talking with some youth peer supporters last week, Maria and I held a community of practice. And yeah, a lot of them are trying to use more telehealth. I agree that I think games are super helpful. So something, especially if you're just starting to work with a young person, that is used as a little bit of breaking the ice. Yeah, using some of those platforms where youth are already on them. So things like Discord, Twitch, platforms that youth already frequently use is a really good idea. Do you folks have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions posted in the chat box. We'll give it a few more moments, and in the meantime, we'll go ahead and post that TA Network survey link for folks to fill out before they leave today. But if folks have any other questions for our presenters today, please go ahead and post that in the public chat box, as we still have a little bit more time. So we'll give you all a little bit more time to get that posted, and in the meantime, I'll go ahead and post the link.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for attending today.
Hello. Thank you so much to our presenters from Portland State University for giving us that wonderful webinar on supervision for youth peer support specialists. Again, please make sure that you fill out the survey that has been left in the chat box. And thank you all so much, and we'll be in touch on the next Direct Connect.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.